Welcome to Tomb of the Topstones, an ongoing series exploring the world of Topstone masks. In this episode, we unearth a character direct from the tomb. The tombs of Egypt, in fact. The Mummy is one of the most iconic and fondly remembered of the original Keith Ward masks. I've interviewed many people about their childhood Topstone memories, and the Mummy keeps coming up in story after story. It seems like every kid had a Topstone mummy or knew someone who did. The earliest known record of the Mummy mask is a 1956 catalog, though it could have been introduced even earlier. It was officially trademarked in 1961, along with the rest of Topstone's major characters, probably in preparation for the company's reorganization. I am not aware of an earlier mummy mask from any manufacturer. Certainly not one with the wide distribution that Topstone enjoyed. Don Post Studios had not yet released their legendary Universal Monster masks. It seems that the Topstone mummy had little or no competition during its first several years of production, a fact that probably contributed to its popularity. If you wanted a mummy mask, Topstone was the only game in town. Mummy mania had swept the world after Howard Carter discovered the tomb of King Tutankhamun in 1922. The subsequent exhibition of the King Tut artifacts gave rise to the Art Deco Egyptian revival movement of the 1920s. Fascination with ancient Egypt continued into the 1930s when Universal Studios launched its Mummy film franchise, beginning in 1932 with The Mummy starring Boris Karloff, and continuing through the 1940s with the Karis series of mummy films. The series concluded in 1955 with Abbott and Costello Meet the Mummy. It was perhaps no coincidence that the introduction of the Topstone mummy roughly coincided with the release of the Abbott and Costello movie. But the Topstone mummy is not based on any movie. One of the things that made the Keith Ward masks classics was their sheer originality. Most of them had no media tie-in. They were not based on pre-existing character designs. They sprang from Keith Ward's imagination. Ward could have easily based his mummy sculpt on one of the Universal movie versions, tweaking it just enough to avoid a lawsuit. Most companies probably would have done that, but Keith Ward had a different approach. He found inspiration not in the movies, but in history. Ward based his sculpt on the real-life mummy of Ramses II, or Ramses the Great. Ramses is one of the most celebrated rulers of the ancient world. His mummy is amazingly preserved and on display at the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. The mummy of Ramses possesses very distinctive features. There is no mistaking its likeness in the Keith Ward sculpture. But we don't have to surmise that Ward based his design on Ramses. It is a matter of government record. The 1961 copyright lists the Topstone mask as depicting Ramses by name. Topstone never used the Ramses Connection in its marketing, but it's specified in the copyright language. To the public, though, the mask was always simply called Mummy. There are two existing masters for the Keith Ward mummy, and here is one of them. These urethane rubber masters were used to create the plaster molds from which the latex masks were made. You can see that this master has some damage to the top of its head. It was repaired at the factory and continued to be used in production. The other surviving master does not have this damage. This modern latex pole was made from molds cast from the undamaged master. It is made of thick latex and painted by VXX Effects Studios. These modern editions of the Topstone masks are created by independent artists for the collector market. They use the vintage masters to make new plaster molds. The new masks tend to be much thicker and more carefully painted than the original Topstone masks. And here is an original, vintage Topstone mummy mask. This mask was made in the Topstone factory in Connecticut, probably during the 1950s or 60s. This is what you would have received if you ordered it from Famous Monsters magazine or bought it in a store for Halloween. You can see the Ramses likeness quite plainly. It's obviously him. Imagine a time traveler going back to 1270 BC and telling the greatest pharaoh in Egyptian history that 3,000 years later, little children would be running around wearing his face as a plaything. Here is another original production example of the mask. This one is slightly smaller, and the paint is a little sloppier. It is likely that this mask was made later, perhaps from molds a generation removed from the larger mask. With each successive generation of molds, the mask would become smaller. But both these masks have amazing detail. Notice the realistic texture of the bandages. You can see the individual fibers, evidence that Keith Ward probably used real fabric on the sculpture. But now look at the master. The detail is much softer. You can't see the individual fibers as distinctly as you can on the rubber masks. The modern reproduction mask has the same soft detail. You can't see the fabric fibers on the modern mask either. In most cases, the modern Topstones have more detail than the original production masks. But that is not the case with the mummy. This tells me that both surviving masters are a generation removed from Keith Ward's original 1950s master. That would make sense if the mummy mask were so popular that they wore out the first master and had to make a second and third copy from the original. In the 1980s, Topstone replaced the Keith Ward masks with resculpted versions. Here is the resculpted 80s mummy. It retains more of the Keith Ward character than some of the other 80s resculpted masks. In photos, it is sometimes hard to tell which is which. In person, the differences are easier to see. The bandages are noticeably different. They are much more uniform on the 80s mummy, as if he were freshly wrapped. They do not have as much texture and detail as the original 50s sculpt. Though the mummy is by no means common, it is not as difficult to find as some of the other classic Topstone masks. This is another indicator that the mummy might have been produced in greater numbers than most other Topstone characters. Maybe it was a bestseller, or maybe the simple design and minimal paint scheme made it easier and cheaper to produce. A relative of the mummy is the 60s era mask called Bandaged Head in the Famous Monsters ads. It looks like Keith Ward used the same fabric bandages he used in the mummy sculpt. The texture, edges, and stray fibers are the same. Perhaps this mask was his way of using up the rest of the bandages after he finished the mummy sculpt. I had this mask as a kid. I would often wear the teenage werewolf mask beneath this bandage face. When I was playing with my friends, I would wait for a dramatic moment, then pull the bandages off and reveal the hideous werewolf face underneath. Topstone made vacuform plastic versions of most of the Keith Ward characters, but I have never seen a plastic version of the mummy. I would be surprised if it did not exist, but I've never seen an example in a photo or in person. If someone out there has one, I would love to see it. That concludes our look at the Topstone mummy. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please share it and help spread the word about the tomb of the Topstones.